Back in 1963, the 22-year-old Bob Dylan wrote a protest song that was so much more than just a song. It was basically a blueprint for how political manipulation works. So today, we're going to take that 60-year-old song and use it as a surprisingly sharp tool to understand how grievance gets manufactured and, weaponized in our politics right now. All right, let's get into it. Right out of the gate, Dylan just throws this massive curveball at us. He describes this horrific murder, and then in the very next breath, he basically says the killer isn't really to blame. And that one line, it just forces you to ask this really uncomfortable question. If the guy who pulled the trigger isn't the one to blame, then who is? And what in the world is their game?
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the real-life historical event that lit the fuse for this song. Then, we'll take apart the political machine that Dylan is describing piece by piece. After that, we're going to see if we can apply this old framework to a modern case study. And finally, we'll try to figure out what it even means to be a pawn in today's world.
To really get what this game is all about, we've got to go back in time. We need to understand the event that put all the pieces on the board in the first place. We're heading back to the absolute height of the civil rights movement in America.
Okay, so check this out. On June 12, 1963, the civil rights activist Medgar Evers is murdered in his own driveway. And then, get this, less than a month later, Bob Dylan is already on stage singing this song. This wasn't some historical reflection written years after the fact. No, this was an immediate, raw, gut-level analysis of a political assassination practically as it was happening.
And here's the crucial point, the thing that changes everything. Dylan is not interested in telling a simple whodunit story. He knows who fired the gun. He says a finger fired the trigger, but he immediately pivots. He's trying to tell us that if you really want to understand where this violence comes from, you have to look past the individual and start analyzing the system that created him.
Okay, so what is this system? How does it actually work? Well, Dylan basically gives us a playbook. He lays out this entire political ecosystem with very specific roles. He gives us the full anatomy of their game.
First up, we've got the pawn. Now, in Dylan's telling, this isn't some naturally evil person. This is someone who has been systematically programmed in his schools, by his culture, to hate. And why? To distract him so he never stops to think about his own terrible economic situation. His anger is absolutely real, but it has been carefully aimed at the wrong target.
And who's aiming that anger? Well, that would be the player, the politician who profits from all this division. By creating a scapegoat, the player gets to climb the ladder of power and fame, making sure the pawn never looks up to see who's really benefiting from his struggle.
But here's the thing. The player isn't acting alone. Not even close. He's got the whole system backing him up. The entire state apparatus, from the local cops all the way up to the governor's mansion. They're the ones who make the game seem legit, who get paid to keep things just the way they are, and who ultimately use the pawn like a disposable tool.
What's so wild here is how you can boil this whole strategy down into 3 simple, repeatable steps. Step 1, create a sense of grievance, telling one group they have more to lose. Step 2, redirect all that anger toward a common enemy. And step 3, make sure the real power structure never, ever changes, keeping the pawn stuck at the back of the train, right where he started. It's a perfect, vicious cycle.
So, yeah, that was the game in 1963. But doesn't this all sound a little familiar? I mean, this analysis of scapegoating and engineered anger feels almost eerily current. So the big question is, does this 60-year-old framework still hold up? Can we actually use it as a lens to understand what's happening right now?
To put it to the test, we're going to apply Dylan's framework to analyze the political narrative of Donald Trump. And let's be super clear, we're not talking about specific policies here. We're looking at the mechanics of the storytelling, how grievance is shaped into loyalty. And when you put them side by side, the connection becomes pretty hard to ignore. Dylan's blueprint was all about using racial and class resentment for political gain. A modern version follows a similar playbook, but it identifies new villains. The elites, immigrants, the media. It channels all that voter frustration toward them, and in doing so, creates this incredibly powerful bond of loyalty and shared identity.
And a key tool in this modern version of the game is the slogan. Think about it. Each one of these phrases takes a deeply complex issue, economic anxiety, immigration, political corruption, election integrity, and just compresses it down into a simple, powerful, and emotionally charged rallying cry. It's the perfect way to organize outrage while completely bypassing any kind of nuanced debate.
Which brings us right back to Dylan's really provocative claim. If supporters are responding to this kind of political engineering, where exactly does the responsibility lie?
Does a framework like this let individuals off the hook for what they believe and do? Or does it just give us a much deeper, more complicated context for it?
And all of this leads us to our final, and maybe the most important question of all. How should we even hear that word pawn in the 21st century? What does it really mean?
Well, one way to hear it is as a profound insult, right? It kind of suggests a person has no free will, that they can't think for themselves, that they're just a mindless piece being moved around a board by someone smarter and more powerful.
But you could look at it from a totally different angle. Maybe it's actually a term of compassion. In this view, the pawn is a victim, someone who's being manipulated by these massive forces way outside of their control. And blaming them would be like blaming the hammer instead of the person swinging it.
But then there's a third option. What if pawn isn't a judgment call at all? Not an insult, but also not an excuse. Maybe it's just a cold, ruthless diagnosis. A functional term that describes a role somebody is playing, whether they know it or not, inside a political game designed to hoard power.
And that leaves us with this. If politics really is a game, just like Dylan framed it, with clear rules about how to manufacture grievance and reward loyalty, then we have to apply that analysis to our world today. The most important question isn't whether the game exists, but forcing ourselves to identify the roles. Who, right now, is the pawn, and who is the player?